So I'd like to welcome Merv from AI Ethicist, a very well-known organization, and I'll talk to Merv in a little bit to introduce what they do and kind of their thought leadership, and also Behnaz, who's going to talk about the perspectives from an applied AI and how governance fits into this and plays a role. So without further ado, I'd like to start by asking the basic question. Merv, I'd like to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your organization, tell us about your role, and tell us specifically how it is that you actually work with AI governance.
Absolutely, and so glad to be here, Shwik, and thanks for having me. So I wear multiple hats. I'm the founder of AIethicist.org. Underneath that, provide consultancy and training services and advisory services to organizations, whether it's C-level or the board of directors in terms of governance and strategy, or whether it's actually working with the teams in terms of developing and implementing AI in an ethical and responsible way, or whether it's just like red teaming and being a trusted partner with those organizations. I teach data ethics at the Masters of Applied Data Science program at University of Michigan. And I also wear a policy hat, the Senior Research Director at Center for AI and Digital Policy. With the center, our whole focus is AI policy and AI regulations. So we provide advisory to different governments and international organizations in terms of national AI strategies, AI policies, and regulations in general.
Okay, thank you, Merv. That's great. And we look forward to hearing your insights about these interesting topics. And Behnaz, the same question for you. Tell us a little bit about your role, your background, and how sort of your work has you engaging with AI governance.
Thank you, Vic. First of all, thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be part of this interesting conversation today. So as you mentioned, Vic, I'm on the applied side of the house. My background used to be in data science. I was doing a PhD in operations research, which is the optimization side of AI, almost a decade ago. However, I moved into more of the applied world rather than the academic one, if you will. So I got into professional services, did the majority of my career at McKinsey, using analytics, digital transformations, and strategy within the operations and supply chain and procurement world. Currently, my most recent role, I'm part of the executive team of an AI startup in the Canadian AI ecosystem. So what we do is basically we develop custom apps, applications, or custom software powered by AI, meaning that the most important component of those solutions are AI algorithms, and we help companies solve their complex supply chain and operations questions and challenges using AI and digitization, which is an enabler to AI. And I believe what I bring into this conversation is, I would say I don't see my role as a policymaker, but more on the ground, working hand in hand with the companies who are trying to implement those policies along with their AI journey. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Behnaz. That's great. So I'd like to stay with you, Behnaz, and ask the question when it comes to, because you work a lot with clients, you said that focus on applied AI. So what does success look like in the development and also the implementation of AI governance?
Yeah, I would say the space I mostly operate, there's a context, right? Because when we say ethics and AI, it's important also to consider the risks and what are the implications of things going wrong, if I want to simplify. So we are mostly in the applied space in operations and supply chain. So things or AI solutions not delivering on their mandate means that the companies would not be able to realize the business case or realize the impact that they were expecting off of their investments. I understand that in legal situations, HR situations, or even banking, I know you have a session in 2 weeks on that, like AI algorithms and decisions going wrong could lead to very, very severe discriminations against certain personas or certain profiles of humans. So I would say we have less of that problem in the applications and the space, applied space that I'm operating. However, it is still very important to have the governance in place. So what does success look like? What does success look like is have the structure and the governance in some shape or form, which embodies the processes, people trained, to use those processes or those tools, etc., so that the investment of the companies deliver on the impact. And the impact is efficiencies, is growth, is saving jobs, is upgrading skill sets. So it's all of those impacts, and the lack of the right governance would mean that the investment would not deliver. And most of these organizations are new, companies are investing, they agree on the what, they don't know about the how. So things going wrong could mean that would be the AI journey of those companies. So the success is solutions delivering on the impact, the solutions being sustainable and repeatable, meaning that the data feeding into these solutions, it evolves. AI models evolve over time. The data evolves over time. So making sure that we have the automatic processes and systems in place so that the solutions continue to deliver on what has been designed for. And basically, and obviously there's an element of transparency and fairness. Like I said, fairness might or might not be relevant in all the solutions we develop, but I would say definitely transparency and user adoption is extremely important, because the end users, their day-to-day jobs are tied to these solutions. Sometimes their incentives, sometimes their end-of-year bonuses, sometimes their promotions, their careers tied to these solutions. So having that transparency so the users will trust and use and adopt and grow these solutions is key for the AI journey in any organization.
Thank you, Behnaz. That's very interesting. And Merv, I'd like to ask you the same question, also with the context as Behnaz shared, that AI governance is not something that can be looked at sort of independent of the organization's strategy, operations, or tactics. So what does success look like, Merv, from your vantage point when it comes to design and implementation of AI governance?
I like the fact that you differentiate between design or development versus the implementation, because I think there's a slightly different priority and across those. So when you're looking at design and development of the governance as regards to AI, it's really about figuring out the value alignment, and Behnaz mentioned the business case. So what is the company would like to do, and how do they want to use the AI? What's the business case for it, and how it should align with the organization's values? That should be the key thing. And it really requires at that development and design stage some dedicated resources to create a strategy and a roadmap for that particular organization, who would then have that dedicated role to start rolling that out. It cannot be like a side project for a number of people. Even in a startup environment, I know you're wearing multiple hats, but it needs to be embedded in the expectations or responsibilities of those people, so they can start executing that roadmap and have like top-down and bottom-up engagement. When you're moving to the implementation stage, when we talk about governance, it's really about, in addition to what Behnaz said, clear-cut responsibilities for each role across the AI lifecycle. And I underline each role because it's not only about the developers, the engineers, etc. It starts from project managers all the way to sales and customer engagement. Everyone needs to have clear-cut responsibilities and accountability in that. Because a lot of the times you see a distributed responsibility, if it's not that clear, might lead to things falling between the cracks, and you end up with gaps. So making sure that there aren't any gaps across the life cycle. Obviously, continuous impact assessments, and coupling that with quality and risk assessment and monitoring. Your job with regards to governance doesn't end once the model or the product is out there and out in the wild. And then success, I think, looks like once the organization, everyone involved, has that muscle of critical questioning and application of AI ethics and responsible development and implementation as second nature. and it's embedded into the relevant processes. Behnaz mentioned, some people like their salaries or incentives are aligned with this. When I say value alignment and aligning with all these processes, you also need to look at if there is something in your organization that is going to be in conflict with the governance, you might be asking for such and such in the governance model. But if that is in conflict with the incentives or the bonus structure, so people don't have an incentive to bring up concerns, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. So it needs to be a holistic approach, and obviously transparency that is coupled with documentation. So you're keeping that organizational know-how and institutional knowledge moving.
That's great. Thank you, Merv. So I'd like to ask you the follow-up question that sort of builds on some of the things you mentioned. We hear a lot of times nowadays when we talk about governance of AI, we talk about subjects like ethical AI, responsible AI, beneficial AI. So Merv, my question to you is, how do you factor in the characteristics of ethical AI, responsible AI into a practical, pragmatic AI governance approach? From a design and an implementation perspective. So how do responsible and ethical AI concepts fit into AI governance? Merv?
Definitely when you have the processes and mechanisms, like I said, it can be anything from hiring to incentives to public relations, etc. The values and requirements of that are aligned with the ethics of AI or the responsible development or implementation. If your organization has certain values, like right now we're seeing a lot of organizations almost every day coming up with their own AI or data ethics principles, right? So making sure that those are actually in practice, whether it's your product, how your product operates. So if one of your principles or values is, I respect privacy of my consumers, how does that translate into all of your data collection, processing, and retention mechanisms? So just identifying your principles and then looking at, okay, because I respect, say, fairness, or because I respect privacy, this is how I'm going to reflect that in my products and in my services, etc. Another thing is making sure that everyone involved in the life cycle understands the possible risks and harms associated with certain AI systems, as well as their own contribution to it. I mentioned clear-cut responsibilities, but if, say, you're in the coding team, you might not necessarily have that FaceTime or interaction with the clients, with the customers, like a salesperson would do, and might not necessarily get that feedback directly from how the client is implementing. Is the way that they're implementing in alignment with the intended purposes of the system, or if they're using it for something totally unpredicted, which is going to cause risks or issues for your organization. Making sure that everyone involved knows the risks, or can identify, or has the tools and spaces to identify those risks and harms, and being able to bring that back to the organization and back to the process, the life cycle process. It definitely cannot be an afterthought, for sure, and it definitely, we see in some organizations this coming to the nuclear option of whistleblowing. The best practice should be, providing anyone involved with the tools and spaces to bring up their concerns and flag those internally and externally, so you can actually move with that. I think one of the biggest pieces of important pieces in governance is that ability to flag concerns and feedback and act on it.
Great. Thank you, Merv. And Behnaz, the same question. I mean, you have the benefit of working with many clients across industries. How do you see different clients? What are some general things? What are some specific things you've seen, Behnaz, and how these topics of ethical and responsible AI are folded into AI governance?
Absolutely. So I would say everyone talks about it theoretically. Mostly, especially the bigger organizations that we work with, definitely when they embark in the AI journey, meaning that there has been some top-down approval to invest in, and it's not just partnering up with expert companies like us, but it's also building the internal center of excellence that goes hand in hand with that. So anyways, it's a lot of investment. There has been some top-down appetite or pressure, so to speak, or the obligation to stay competitive to embark on the journey. And governance definitely is something that is on the table. Now, the question is that theoretically, everyone agrees again on the what, the question is on the how. The how of it, I believe it goes very hand in hand with the maturity of the organization in the AI journey itself. Most companies are still figuring it out. They know they have to do it. They know that AI is, and digitization as an enabler of AI is the way to go to stay competitive and be efficient and be able to grow efficiently and just, be able to compete in the market. So they know that they have to do it, but they're still figuring out the how. They still figure out this internal talent development. They're still figuring out how to get the ROI out of these investments. So they are not necessarily mature in the whole AI package, so to speak, and governance is no exception because that's part of the journey. I wouldn't call it's an afterthought. I would say governance is there. It starts from, aligned with the AI life cycle. Basically, the governance is there, but it's mostly around making sure that the data that's necessary to get into the models for things to work. And then when the design is finished and then you get into the implementation, and this is a living organization and dynamic solutions. So how do we make sure that the models don't drift and kind of, like I said in my first conversation, how do we make sure that these solutions deliver what they're supposed to deliver? So that's basically what the government is built around. And that kind of, it's mixed with the PMO notion. So it's a mixture of PMO, project management, governance, whatnot. With respect to the ethics side of the governance, it's very case by case and use case dependent. Like I said, it depends when things go wrong, what is the type of things that do go wrong? Definitely in use cases or in the applications where the judgment of the model or decisions of the model could harm humans or lead to some sort of discrimination, there's more scrutiny and governance, I would say, and oversight and monitoring. For the other industry applications, in simple terms, things going wrong are mostly of financial nature. Again, we can say the secondary order of that could be individuals and professional workers, jobs on the line, or incentives or bonuses, or livelihood. Basically their bonuses on the line. So that is an implication, but again, there's degrees to the severity of the implication. So I would say, depending on the severity, the governments could be more tight versus not. They have the notion of the governance, but I wouldn't call it that all the governance is very exhaustive and a holistic set of coverage to make sure nothing goes wrong. There's definitely areas of improvement. There's baby steps. Most companies that are in several years into their AI journey, they are also advancing on the governance side, but not necessarily the textbook governance that you see. There's a checklist of all the roles and responsibilities and all the processes. So I haven't seen that yet in practice, to be honest. There's definitely a path, but I can't name like a live example when somebody has it all right and they have a holistic governance model and structure in place yet.
Okay, thank you for that, Behnaz. And I'd like to start the next question with you, Behnaz, which is the following. We started by speaking about this notion of what does success look like? What are some of the factors that organizations need to prioritize if they want to be successful in AI governance? The opposite of success certainly is failure, and I think it's important to learn and to talk about that as well. So what are some common pitfalls and sort of obstacles or hurdles that your clients and you've seen when it comes to the design and implementation of AI governance?
Absolutely. So I love the fact that we started to segregate design and implementation just to make it easier. So design, you can get it right. You can just go by the book, by the textbook, by checklist, and hit it all right when you're doing the design. But implementation is where things happen. And like I said, these are live mechanisms. AI models are living models. They need to be maintained and supervised and audited, whatnot. So that's where things start to drift. Now the pitfalls. When you talk about the pitfalls, I don't see AI implementation, I would say, just to simplify, much different from the good old classical change management. It's a type of change. The nature of the solutions being implemented, the mindset coming to it is different from digital solutions that are more static in nature. And the black box C nature of AI is also different, because digital solutions are mostly rule-based. You can explain it. AI sometimes, depending on the technology you're using, is not that explainable. So these are the challenges, and the challenges. There's an asymmetry of knowledge if you compare the AI solution provider versus the user of it, so that there's an imbalance of power, so to speak, there. So these are the challenges, top challenges of an AI solution versus a classical software or a digital solution. So things going wrong, going back to the change management, you want to get a change management right. You need to make sure, and Marvin mentioned it very well, you have the people, process, and tools. You need all the three. These are the three legs of the triangle. You can't succeed like any other rollout program or any change management. You can't succeed without the three. And it might be different things, but you need your people to be trained, to be brought on up to speed, to be bought into the solution for any solution to go live and to deliver the impact it's supposed to deliver. You have the technology side, and then we're going to have, we can have detailed conversations around the data. Again, depending on the use case, there's techniques and ways to detect the biases in the data. So that's definitely a way that things go wrong, like the bias sampling you have. And people talk about data is biased. Well, data is not necessarily biased. It's the decisions in the past that were biased, that are kind of embodied in the decisions. It's the practices that are sometimes biased that are reflected in data. So the data itself is not biased on its own, or the sampling practices are biased. So again, even the data goes back to the human practices and the historical data that are kind of, we should question, do we want the future to replicate the past, or are we going to do things differently? So the data and technology side of it is definitely one side of it. Under technology, we can think about the choice of the models. What are the set of the models that we couple together so that the black box is somehow embedded with some explainable or a rule-based approach, so you can go hand in hand and just, first validate the results. And there's, again, techniques around how to do that, and how do you bring the human in the loop or over the loop to make sure that goes right. And then the last one is the processes. It's the processes of, okay, people are trained, the tool is there. Do you have legacy processes, tradition? Like, you have to do something different. If you want to keep your own traditional way of doing things, you can throw any talented humans on it or any cutting edge solution on it. It's not going to work. So the processes need to be aligned, and lack thereof would be a pitfall, obviously. And it goes back to they're all humans at the end of the day using these solutions. And are the incentives and KPIs that are aligned? If it's not aligned, you can put all the solutions and all the processes in place. If humans don't have a reason or don't trust that this is not harming them, if they use these solutions, they're not going to use it. They find all the ways not to use it. And at end result would be that the solution is not delivering on the impact. So things going wrong. If you get blindsided by the fact that people, processes, and tool are all important, and you have to still go through the traditional change management steps of, let's train the people, let's have the champions, let's make sure there's alignment from the top, let's make sure we walk the talk, which is Marvin talked about the values. If your values is not reflected in how you treat your people, is how you design your solutions, how your solution is impacting your people, or how your solution is impacting your end customers, they're all connected. If that top-down alignment is not there, then something's going to break. If you just focus on the tool, which I see a lot on the ground, Vic, one pitfall is that companies think, some companies, less and less, but at the time, and I see the evolution in the past 3 years, they thought that, I need to hire data scientists and we're going to be AI ready. That's not how it works. It's a teamwork. It takes a village. It's not Merva said it. It's not data scientists. You need product owners. You need product managers. You need developers. You need all of it. You need all of the above. Hiring just data scientists wouldn't make you an AI-centric company, and it wouldn't deliver a solution. It wouldn't help you roll out a solution. It's a teamwork. So focusing on just the technology, I'm going to hire data scientists, I'm going to develop something and magic will happen. This is a big pitfall. There's other things. There's people and there's processes, and they go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you, Behnaz. Yes, that's very comprehensive. Merv, the same question for you. In your professional opinion and in your survey of the landscape, what are some of the hurdles and obstacles that you'd like to build on top of the ones that Behnaz has mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. That was pretty comprehensive. So in addition to what Behnaz said, I think some of the stuff that I keep coming across as legal doesn't mean it's ethical. A lot of the times you see companies who are like saying, hey, we're in compliance with regulations, we're in compliance with our requirements. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're developing or implementing the systems in a responsible way. So you need to think about, be more visionary and think about how you're impacting different groups, different society, your consumers, etc. And also another pitfall or another maybe shortcoming, I might say, is treating the problems with AI systems down to dataset issues or like bias in dataset issues, etc. If you just reduce it to datasets and then the governance and safeguards that you put around is going to be impacted by how you frame the problem, how you think where you should think that you're going to have governance or tools and processes, etc. So that is going to impact how you define the problem, is going to impact what you do about it. That reductionist perspective of just thinking that, okay, it's a data problem, the data set, bias issue, or the more data I get, the better my AI model is going to be, takes away from the fact that algorithmic systems are, they encompass more than data. They are socio-technical systems. They interact with their environments and shape and change the environments, and the people or the groups involved in those. To Behnaz's point, they might replicate the biases or replicate the structural issues in our societies. So in order to avoid that pitfall, I always say, know the context of your problem, the problem that you're trying to solve, understand the context, understand the history of that problem, and spend a lot of time about how to frame the question right. Don't take a data set that you found or you can get your hands onto and say, hey, I'm going to ask this questions to data. I'm going to ask this question because my data has the answers for that. You need to come up with a proper definition of the problem or objective, and then find, understand the context and move from there and put the governance methods on top of that. And I think another one is algorithms, AI systems move in context-specific ways. Behnaz mentioned that too. So understanding that context, again, is crucial for you to be able to see what harms and risks the system can bring, and how it can be used for malicious purposes. I mentioned it before, with the best of intentions, you can put something out there, but someone else can come in and use it for very malicious purposes, harmful ways. What do you do about that? Your governance need to take into consideration what you do when that happens. And then finally, one of the pitfalls I see is someone higher up, a senior decision maker, sees something, an AI product, and without understanding what it means for the organization, without understanding the capacity within their organization and how it might fit with the rest of the processes and systems in the organization, they're like, "Ooh, nice shiny thing," and bring that in, implement it in our organization. But then you might be breaking the rest of what was working inside the organization. So I always say, it might in fact be the solution that you were looking for. That AI system might in fact be a great addition to your organization. But start with pilot projects, understand what it takes, what it does, what it doesn't do, learn what you need in terms of within your organization, in terms of training and infrastructure and resources, and then expand from that instead of bringing something and kind of parachuting on top of your organization. And again, you're shooting yourself on the foot.
Okay, thank you, Merv. So I'd like to ask you the next question, Merv. Your excellent initiative on aiethicist.org. I've used the website very, very regularly. And so the question has to do with the proliferation of AI strategy, AI governance type frameworks. There's a lot of them. For instance, the Alan Turing Institute, universities have released various frameworks, United Nations, World Economic Forum. So my question is, in your experience, and you've worked with a lot of these frameworks, certainly they're listed on the website that you manage. So which would be one that you would say is that you found to be most useful? Or if we don't want to pick one specifically, what are the traits of a good AI governance framework, as opposed to necessarily AI governance practices and strategy? In terms of a framework view, what would be some common characteristics of the ones that you advise your clients or that you use yourself?
Absolutely, and I think I'll pick the latter because it is very context specific. It really depends on where you want to, in what domain, what industry, what even geographical setting, and for what purpose you're going to use that system. So, like you said, there is a whole list of different frameworks and guidelines and checklists, etc. One, I would say, make sure that it works for your context, whatever you're picking. Second, understand and remember that it's only a checklist or it's only a framework to start some conversation. You shouldn't be bound by what is asked in a framework, what is asked in a checklist. So those are for you to create the tools and the conversations within your organization as per your context. In terms of the traits, for me, it has to have, and you'll see this reflected in the policy work I'm involved in as well, is human rights as foundation for governance, because it places legally binding obligations on nations or organizations to respect, protect, and fulfill those human rights. Principles only. What I've seen over the years as they are proliferating is an organization takes a principle like, for example, fairness, and defines it for their own purposes in a way that fits their existing practices, instead of saying, okay, this is the principle, I'm going to change all my practices, I'm going to align my products and services because I believe in this. So it's almost like shaping the principle according to your practices, where the best practice should be the other way around. If you have principles or if you have a framework that is based on human rights and democratic values and rule of law as fundamentals for your approach, for me, that's best practice, and that's what I try to do, both in the ethics, governance, consultancy, or training space, as well as the policy side. And when you look at organizations like UNESCO or Council of Europe and their AI work, that's also what they're building in terms of international governance.
Thank you, Merv, for that. Behnaz, same question for you, which is of all the frameworks that you've interacted with, what are the characteristics, let's put it that way, of the frameworks that you have found to be most useful, and what are some of those attributes?
Interesting. So I love what Merv said because it synthesizes in a way my understanding and what I've been doing. So it kind of confirms that I've been doing it a bit right and thinking about it, because I'm not a policy maker. That's not my role. But I definitely advise my clients when we are in the design first to make sure that we have the right practices in play because we want to make sure down the road things go live and they stay live. So what really resonated with me is when I look at all these frameworks, like from reputable and obviously famous sources, so to speak. When you look at World Economic Forum, you have researchers in Harvard, McKinsey frameworks resonate a lot with me because, that's how I still operate in a way, and it's very applied. Or McKinsey or Microsoft or IBM, these consulting shops that are more in the applied space. And there's a very nice framework from the government of Singapore, the data protection entity. So there's all of that. In my mind, there's different slicing and dicing and framing and, of the steps. Bottom line, they're kind of saying the same thing, which is exactly what Merva said. It all goes down to the first principles, and the first principles are human rights. It has to be legal, and if I want to translate it, even break it down into the more applied words, it has to be fair. It has to be explainable. You should be able to justify it and sell it and convince your customers or internal employees to use it and adopt it and be comfortable with the results of the solution. So these are the principles. Now, as long as you get those principles right, that's great. What is the best model? The best model is the one that you actually use and implement. The best that it's the right field, and that just does the job. I said it goes with the maturity of the AI journey. It's not an all or nothing type of situation. Any nugget, an ingredient of it that you embed and just implement as part of your change journey or change management or this upskilling of your task force, whatnot, the best one is the one that actually you can use easier and implement it faster. So that's my answer. Now, what are the archetypes? So when I look at it, I see a couple of archetypes of these frameworks. Some are more top down, really top down at a policy level, country policy level, government organization levels, and there's a discourse of, okay, should we just make these things mandatory? Because a lot of these frameworks are nice to have or suggested, but there's most of it is not mandatory and it's not legal yet. So the conversation is that, can we convert these nice to haves or part of it to the legal side of the house, which becomes mandatory? So it's a question of time. It's going to come, but we're not there yet. So that's one archetype. One archetype I can see, it's more of I would say, for simplicity, I can say more of a bottom-up approach. When you look at it like the McKinseys of the world or Microsoft or IBMs of the world, that they're very active in the space, it goes along the life cycle of the solution development, which goes from ideation and design, and then you have this circle of running pilots and see if the data is enough to feed the science to solve the problem at hand. And then when you go through that cycle, the pilots that do survive, they go into implementation. You fit into an operate and maintain phase. And they have attached best practices and roles and responsibilities and checklists and textbook recommendation attached to each of those phases. So I would say in the applied ground, you see most of that. And in the operating space, you see more of how can we have automatic flags and processes and tools so that we can flag models drifting or anomalies and things like that. So I would say there's a top-down, there's a bottom-up, and there's some in between. Like some of the Harvard researchers, I was reading a paper that was around kind of in between, which says, you know what, there's this AI solutions and there's society on top, and in between you can start from the technical layer, which is the data and the solution, then you can go into the ethics, and then in the end you can aspire to bake it into the legal. So it's more of a roadmap around implementation of this top-down and bottom-up. So I've seen it all. These are the three archetypes that I see as frameworks. I guess we can categorize most of all those good resources out there into these three. The problem is not the lack of content. Like Merva said, probably the best thing is a hybrid of those, not force-fitting, not the reverse kind of cheating and kind of selective selection of choice of elements and principles and force-fitting it and reshaping it to fit your organization. It should be the reverse. Let's say if we roll out that type of behavior and those type of intentions, probably the best strategy is kind of a good combination, depending on your maturity, where you stand, a combination of that top-down and bottom-up. And anything that can get you to a faster rollout and implementation. That's the best. And organizations should not take a all or nothing type of approach, saying, oh, you know what, we're not ready yet. Let us just run a couple of solutions. Like in 5 years, we're going to think about governance. So as long as you take baby steps and build the culture that governance should be part of your technical development, that's a big win. And hopefully as companies and solutions mature in the future, we can go closer and closer to that top archetype, which is, okay, how can we turn these nice to haves into should haves, basically.
Thank you, Behnaz. Great answer. And I'd like to ask you the next question, which has to do with, briefly before we started the live stream, we were just chatting a little bit about how quickly the field of AI from a technical perspective is evolving with new algorithms, new architectures, new optimization techniques. And one would argue that the same thing is also happening on the conceptual side, but even on the technical side, on the governance piece of it, new fairness metrics, new algorithmic debiasing techniques, new ways to do explainability, interpretability, counterfactual reasoning, all kinds of things. So my question is, through the lens of AI governance, with everything changing so quickly, Behnaz, what are some sources you refer to keep your knowledge up to date? How do you make sure that your understanding and sort of awareness of the field is current?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll try to tie it into how that maps lays over the governance side of the house. So definitely things are evolving. It's a challenge, but I tend to see the opportunity in it, because as infrastructural and computational capacity, the science has been there for decades. It's more around the computational capacity in the cloud and infrastructure advancement that kind of brought AI to life the way we see it today. So definitely these are opportunities. It means we can even do things faster and in a faster and more efficient way, in a more replicable way. Same things goes with the governance. So governance means having the checks and balances and monitoring mechanisms that are less and less manual and more automated. It means that we can do governance in a more efficient manner at scale. And definitely for that, these fast pace of advancement of not just the science, but engineering and infrastructure and cloud side of the house definitely helps put in place governance, I would say, systems, for the lack of better word. So it's a positive, it's a good thing. Now, how do I personally keep up to speed? I don't claim that I can. It's a humanly possible, honestly. It goes down to what is the niche or expertise or your focus at the time. I don't believe that we are born to live one way or one profession, and there's chapters, and there's definitely room to change and grow. The way I look at it, and the way I do a lot of mentorship for younger professionals or even scientists getting into the field, and I tell them, listen, look at life in chapter. You don't have to commit to anything for life, but at least go all in into one thing. It could be the science side, could be the product side, could be the engineering side. Within science, it's an ocean. It's an ocean. Just pick your niche, focus on it for a couple of years or whatever timeline that makes sense, and try to literally pick your battles. But make sure one thing that you choose, you have the passion for it, because it's, again, an ocean of information. It's impossible to claim that, I know it all, I keep up to date with anything. It's just, you cannot claim that. So have the passion so you can power through all of that and just be the expert on a few things, because you cannot claim that you're an expert in a lot of things. It doesn't exist. So selecting your niche, selecting your focus based on your passion and competency, and that could change in chapters. For instance, right now, I am mostly in operating the supply chain space, and even within supply chain, there's several subgroups, but that's I tend to focus. But nevertheless, there are overarching themes that I would say, always make sure that you have the enough knowledge on the overarching themes. You can be in finance, you can be in healthcare, you can be in operations, supply chain, doesn't matter. In the AI space, I would say ethics and governance definitely is an overarching theme that everyone should be. You don't have to be a policymaker, but again, you have to realize that that's part of your job, no matter your functional expertise within the AI ecosystem. So ethics, like I said, and fairness is a definitely principal overarching theme. The second one is sustainability, we just mentioned in our pre-call. That's one of my passions, and the impact of your solutions and activities on the planet should definitely be also on the radar, no matter what piece of the puzzle within the AI ecosystem you're operating in.
Thank you, Benaz. And same question for you, Merv, and with the added context that with AIethicist.org, which is certainly a reference that I use very frequently. It's a great catalog and a repository of thought leadership, whether it's frameworks, whether it's guidebooks, manuals, etc. So how do you keep up, Merv, with all of this information that comes at us so quickly, but also in terms of curating the content on the website? What's your filters for making sure only high quality frameworks and approaches get published on that website?
So in terms of the development, it's very fast evolving, and I think that's a very good thing. The conversation around AI ethics and responsible AI and the actual impacts of the socio-technical systems was not a mainstream. Maybe it's not even mainstream still, but it wasn't to this extent. If you go back like 5-6 years ago, it was more like on the academic grounds or academic environments. So I love the fact that there's so much to catch up and follow. What you cannot do with all this development, and especially if you're developing and launching AI products, AI systems, is doing this in a vacuum inside your own organization. The best practice or a better practice is making sure that you connect with your external stakeholders and peers and industry teams. There are not many industry standards when it comes to AI systems or autonomous systems at the moment. If you want to be more involved, keep more up to date, working with those communities, working groups that are working on building these governance mechanisms. There's something I do, whether it's IEEE or IEC or for Humanities Center, etc. I'm involved in different parts. Get involved with communities, responsible tech communities, and I do this almost around the clock. Maybe a bit sad, but sometimes I dream about AI. But every day I learn from these communities. There's only so much I can foresee with my own experiences. So understanding where people are coming from, how they interpret certain concepts or implementations. Every day is a learning process. So I'd say make sure that you're involved in those communities. And then I'm a big believer in audits. So even if it's not even if it's not legally mandated, I would say in my third-party audits, just like we do with vulnerability tests, penetration tests, or like ethical red teams, etc. Invite third parties in and who don't have any investment inside the organization. Like let them tell you what they see as risks or harms, etc. Let them bring their own perspectives so you can build a better product. And try to incorporate this as by design, so privacy by design, responsible or ethical development by design. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. This cannot be an afterthought. So the earlier that you start doing this bit by bit and turning into a by design project, the more successful your product is going to be, and second, the more space that you're going to have between you and a lot of other organizations or competitors out there. And last piece is sometimes there's this conversation around responsible design. It slows down the process, or ethics slows down the process, regulation slows down innovation, etc. My argument against that is responsible design actually makes your product more innovative and better. Instead of just creating something and putting it out there without any controls, any governance, any critical thinking, going through this questioning, going through this design processes actually makes your product more innovative, more aligned with your clients, and more beneficial to the society as well.
Thank you, Merv. And in the interest of time, we have a few interesting comments in the chat. I'm going to pick one, and I'd like to have both of you respond to this, and we can close out after this. So the question has to do with organizational structures. So how centralized should the governance be, and how do you overcome the challenges of low digital literacy and data literacy as well when everyone wants to play a role in this governance? Merv, can I start with you first, and then we'll go to Behnaz. Merv, so
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think that's one of the reasons I said start with a pilot project and kind of understand what that your gaps are in terms of capacity, literacy, governance methods, and what that governance roadmap looks like, and then expand upon that. I don't think that should be like governance structure. You need dedicated roles to make sure that there's accountability, but like I said, it has to be across the whole life cycle. It needs to be built in everyone involved in the life cycle of the system, from the salesperson, your call center person, to the developers themselves, anyone and everyone in between, because all of those roles actually contribute to a different part of how the systems interact and change their environments, change how the customers use it, change customers' perception and trust in the systems. So making sure that you map that out, map that out, and look to reduce those gaps in terms of resources and literacy and capacity.
Okay, thank you, Merv. And Behnaz, same question for you as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we oftentimes get this centralized versus decentralized question, and which one is better and how. So I would say there's no single winning recipe. Again, it goes with the maturity of the organization and the maturity of the AI journey without the organization. I would say oftentimes, you go with some sort of a central function when you're building center of excellence, or the governance that goes with it. It could be center of holding the knowledge, executing the projects, and the governance of it. And then as the company matures and it grows, and you feel like, okay, now we can decentralize because entities, business units, whatnot, depending on the context, are mature enough to own and operate the full cycle within themselves. So centralized is a go-to starting point, because the maturity is not there yet. Now the question is that how do you deal with the situation of everyone wanting to be part of it? It's not a necessarily bad thing. Exactly as Merv said, you need different personas along the life cycle. And again, if you look at some of these frameworks, I can pick McKinsey as an example. It goes with some sort of a recipe. What is the persona and type of involvement you need depending on where you are in the life cycle of the solution development? But I would say overall, not the whole organization, but I would say the whole entities that are impacted by the solution or they have to play a role in the implementation and livelihood of the solution need to be involved. They need to be involved and heard, and their input should be considered in a design and a rollout. Definitely in longer term, and the governance, should everyone have a voting seat at the governance? That's to be discussed. It's case by case. You can have a standalone governance, could be external, could be internal, but somebody or a group of people who don't necessarily have an incentive either way. So it has to be a neutral entity to take input from all these stakeholders, but it doesn't mean that the whole stakeholders should be involved in the governance. These are two different things. So everyone wants to be involved. Yes, they should be, but how? I guess that's a question to explore. Being involved doesn't mean that everyone should sit at the governance table. Probably you want to keep that as a standalone entity, but definitely their inputs and implication of the solutions on their life is something that should be considered in the whole design and implementation and rollout.
Thank you, Behnaz, and thank you also, Merv, on behalf of the Synthetic Intelligence Forum for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation. And as this field is evolving very rapidly, we'd love to have you back in a couple of months to share your updated view of the landscape. Next week, we're going to have another session on this topic. So really definitely looking forward to see what the complementary and synergistic types of themes are in that discussion as well. But on behalf of the SIF, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and we'd like to have you back soon. Bye for now.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.